important and timely considering all that has happened with Ukraine. There's so much going on. A number of critical pacts were signed last week with various Western powers as well as Japan. I thought it is time to have Professor Yoshiko Herrera from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She's a professor of political science, and her research focuses on Russian politics, nationalism, identity, and ethnic politics. She's been on a whole lot of different shows. Um, and so it's my pleasure to welcome back Professor Herrera. Thanks so much for making time, Professor.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for inviting me.
The question that pops to my mind, and in case folks, if you've been not quite in the weeds on Ukraine, um, they have suffered losses of territory, especially in the northeast of their country. There's been critical attacks on their power plants and energy infrastructure by Russia. They've suffered, frankly, some severe losses. All of this coming, on the heels of the United States delay in funding. Now we're seeing additional pacts with other Western allies of Ukraine's as well as Japan just last week. Is this too little, too late, Professor?
No, I don't think it's um well, okay, that is a narrative that some people have. But it could be more. It could have been sooner. But our aid is making a difference, and you can already see since April that it's made a difference. So I don't think, it's not like we missed the bus. Um
Thank
There's still a
goodness.
lot to be done. Yeah, there's still a lot to be done. I mean, people can debate maybe some things could have been done differently in the first year of the war, which would have changed the trajectory maybe for the second year, for the offensive. Different things could have happened. But at this point, I think the commitment by the US in April of this year was really important.
And
And
just last week,
there've been some interesting things that have come up even recently in the last week or so.
yeah, please tell people a little bit of the detail of what those things are. And why does all of this matter? We obviously understand that Ukraine needs money to fight a war, but it's more than that, isn't it?
Yes. So let's go through a couple of things that happen. One is that the US and other G7 countries, those are kind of like the important big seven countries, agreed to use $50 billion based on interest from frozen Russian assets to fund the Ukrainian government. So that's a huge amount of money. The current military budget of Ukraine is $6 billion. So a $50 billion infusion is obviously like really
Game
important. And that's a
changer.
way, yeah, that's a way of getting Russia essentially to pay for the war. That's not going to be all at once, but still that's pretty important. And there's the rest of the assets also could be used for reconstruction. That's still under debate. Another thing is that the US just passed another round of sanctions against individuals, and they're stepping up work on these secondary sanctions. So the Russian economy has been hobbled, but not really not hobbled enough by the sanctions, and much more could be done on the sanctions. And so some more happened this last week. And another kind of important thing that happened is there was this Ukrainian peace summit over the weekend, and it didn't result in the end of the war. But what was interesting is that 90 countries attended. Now, there's around, let's say, a little bit less than 200 countries in the world. Okay, so that's almost half the countries of the world attended. And 80 of them signed a joint communique saying that they agree with the need for food security, nuclear security, and the return of prisoners and children, which is actually a huge human rights violation that's going on in the war. So that's, I think, kind of interesting to show that so much of the world is on Ukraine's side. So, those are, I guess, some of the big things that happened this week. But in terms of your question of like, why does it matter? Um, That's, I've been thinking about that, and I want to say, you like students always ask me, or actually we ask each other in political science when somebody gives a talk, why should we care about this? Or, what is interesting about this? Um, I think the number one thing, and I'm actually coming to you from Munich here in Germany. I'm here on a fellowship, so it's kind of
Oh my
interesting being.
gosh, thank you for making time
Oh,
late
sure,
in
no
your evening.
No problem. But it's interesting to be here in Europe, and I actually went to Georgia, the country, over the
Mhm.
weekend. Russia had a war with Georgia in 2008, so it's just very interesting to see the perspective on things from here. And the first thing I think Americans need to understand is that Putin is not going to stop with Ukraine. So it's really, I'm sitting here in Munich and kind of the land of the this one of the strongholds of the Nazi movement under Hitler, in terms of regional support for the Nazis. And so everybody's constantly talking about that history and how it unfolded, et cetera. And it's a very clear story of appeasement not working, of a dictator who had plans for taking over other countries, and that's what he was going to do. And no amount of saying, like, okay, what if we give you this? What if we give you that? Will you stop? No, Putin is not going to stop if he is successful in Ukraine. And even if there's a ceasefire, even if he gets some parts of it, he's just going to use that time to build up and go further. So I think that's one thing, is to understand. And also there was just the commemoration of Normandy and the D-Day
Yes.
invasion and all that. So, the parallels with Hitler are sort of very in people's minds here. So the potential for attacking other European states is one thing. But the other thing is that Putin
Which
is
could
out.
draw which could draw the United States into war, especially if
Yes,
they are a member of NATO, which has
yes,
expanded, right? So there's
yes,
and we understand that Joe Biden has expressed reticence with respect to Ukraine joining NATO while this war goes on, because it would de facto require the United States to actually potentially commit troops to help to defend Ukraine. Sorry, didn't mean
yeah.
to
No,
interrupt,
no,
Professor.
no,
Please
that's
continue.
that's exactly right. And actually, the US just signed a bilateral security agreement, a 10-year agreement with
Right.
Ukraine. The language is a little bit vague, but it's kind of a commitment. I mean, it's not ironclad. It says that if there's another attack, we would talk, and it's meant to, quote, accelerate Ukraine's Euro-Atlantic integration, et cetera. So Ukraine cannot join. It's not feasible for Ukraine for many reasons to join NATO while the war is going on. One of the things that Putin wanted from the start was to weaken NATO. In the process of the war, Sweden and Finland have joined, greatly strengthening NATO. And Putin, as part of his, quote, peace plan, which is actually just a set of maximalist gains that have not changed since the start of the war. One of his demands is that Ukraine not be part of NATO, but
Right.
nobody has taken that seriously. So there's a potential for wider war. So I think that's one thing. The US could be drawn into it. It could escalate. So it's very dangerous on that side. I mean, it's very dangerous because of the nuclear weapons, obviously. But the other thing I think people need to understand is that Russia is committed now to an anti-Western, anti-American way of life. And it's not just a little bit less democratic. It's not just saying, okay, I'm going to stay in power for 25 years. It's saying, I'm going to arrest US citizens wherever I have the ability to do so. So Evan Gershkovich, the Wall Street Journal reporter who's in jail. I mean, it's such that any American citizen is in danger if they visit Russia because of potentially being arrested and used as a pawn. But Russia has.
Wasn't there over the week? I'm sorry to interrupt. I think over the weekend, some not a high level person, but some military man did a stopover in Vladivostok on his way home and managed to get himself arrested. He went there to like see his girlfriend. So what you're talking
Yes,
about isn't like
yes,
it just happened this
yes.
weekend in Vladivostok.
Yeah, I think he was arrested a bit earlier, but there
Was
was
he? Okay.
another like I think he was processed or like he had been detained and he's like formally charged, I think.
Charged? No. Okay.
Um,
Thank you.
but yeah, I mean you know, Russia is turning into something like North Korea. So it's not just a little bit of a dictatorship. It's not just a little bit less freedoms or rights. It's becoming a really a place where anybody can. They're arresting teenagers. They're arresting poets. They're arresting journalists. It's a really terrible place that Putin has taken Russia during his reign. Much like North Korea, Iran. I mean, these are the kind of parallels, like literally the worst countries that you can think of in terms of civil rights and liberty. Civil rights and liberties, like, just puts it too nicely. It's like even
Yes.
basic way of living
Freedom of
without.
movement. Freedom of
Yes,
movement is one that I like
yes,
to. Your
yes,
ability to go where you would like, when you would like, is being curtailed to such an extent in Russia. It's for only like a certain segment of the population now that has been pre-approved as if I for,
yes.
more
And
getting around.
Russia is attacking democracies through election interference, propaganda, cybersecurity. There's reports, remember the Havana syndrome?
Yes.
A pretty reputable set of journalists claims that this is a Russian operation. Christo Grozev, he's the one that's in the Navalny movie, etc. Um, so I think that
Hang
we
on,
have to.
if you can hang on one
Sure.
second, Professor. I'm my guest this half hour, such an important topic, Dr. Yoshiko Herrera from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, a Russia expert. We're going to continue to talk about why what Vladimir Putin is doing matters, what our role is as the United States, and why it matters to each and every one of you. Stick with us. We'll be back after these brief messages. I'm Maggie Dawn. You're listening to the Civic Media Radio Network. Back, Wisconsin. I'm Maggie Dawn. You're listening to the Civic Media Radio Network. My guest this half hour is Dr. Yoshiko Herrera of the University of Wisconsin-Madison, a political science professor who specializes in Russia. We've been talking this half hour about what Russia has really become, why what Vladimir Putin is planning isn't just about Ukraine, why it's really about a threat to Western democracy, to Western Europe, and thus is a threat to the United States, an active, everyday threat. Um, Professor, before we went to break, we were getting into sort of there's a very real threat of further invasions, which could drag the United States into armed conflict with Russia, that Putin's plan goes far beyond Ukraine. Tell people like what happens next, right? Like what's the thing that an average American should be looking for? How does this end up hitting our pocketbook? How does it end up impacting our lives, our military? How
Yeah,
much is this? And also another question I'll throw out there for you to think about is the relationship between China and Russia is obviously a critical one. China, Iran, and Russia. There's I hate to use this term because it's old, but an axis of evil in sort of a
yeah,
way that's happening. Please go ahead, Professor.
yeah. Okay, so I think there's a lot of numbers a person could throw around, but I think the easiest way to understand the US support for the Ukraine war financially is that it is not costing us hardly anything. Okay? Because when you put it in perspective and you say, you can start with like, we've committed to them in 5 bills, $175 billion. That's like so much money. Okay, but you take that and you say actually only 107 billion actually goes to Ukraine. The rest of it goes to the US. Within that 107 billion, about 2/3 of that is on weapons. Guess where those weapons are produced? In the United
Here.
States. So, first of all, a lot of the money actually comes back to our economy and states that have defense industries, counties that have defense industries are gaining from that. So that's one thing. The other thing is that if we look at the overall defense budget that we have, the Department of Defense, this is one of our largest, the largest
Budget line items.
budget
Yes.
lines. Um, This is 7%. This big aid package of $61 billion for this year represents 7%. Okay. So if we can degrade Russia's capacities for 7% of our budget, that's obviously not very much. And that's kind of a deal for us. But also, if we look at our overall GDP being the world's largest economy, um, what we're spending on Ukraine is less than 0.5% of our GDP. Okay, it's closer to like 0.3%.
Mm.
So when you look at it that way, and you say a country like Estonia is spending like more than 2.5% of GDP. So I mean that's much more in terms of the percentage that they have. Lots of our European NATO allies are spending in the 2% range on Ukraine aid, military aid. So while we are the largest military aid provider to Ukraine, and that's really important, other countries are also chipping in. And if you look at the overall financial assistance to the government of Ukraine, not just military, the EU is actually spending more than the United States. So I just think there's lots of ways to cut this and say, well, it's this or that, how much. But I would say overall, in terms of our overall defense budget and in terms of our overall economy, it is not a substantial amount given the other things that we spend money on. If you compare to the Afghanistan and Iraq wars, it's very small. I mean, that was over $2 trillion. That's $300 million a day for 20 years, gets you to 2 trillion.
I'm
So
sorry. Can you say that again? $2 trillion in
2.3
Afghanistan.
trillion dollars in
How much is
Afghanistan.
that? How much is that a
That
day?
is $300 million a day for 20 years.
Mm.
Okay.
Eh,
And the thing is that it's very different because we are helping the Ukrainians to do the fighting to defend their own country. It's not going to be a scenario where once we stop helping them, they say, okay, never mind, we're going to switch sides and go
Right.
to the Russian side. We're helping them to maintain their country and their nationhood. So I think that a really important thing I think is for people not to kind of just hear a big number and say like that's too much money, we can't afford it, but instead to think, given the threat that Russia poses to the United States, this is a very small amount of money in order to degrade that threat.
And my brain works a bit as an economist. So apologies to everyone for how brutally transactional this will sound.
Hmm.
But the way that one basic way that I think a lot of my conservative friends might contextualize this is is this: from a return on investment in terms of the United States security and avoidance of future exponentially exploding security costs. Every US dollar spent in Ukraine is probably returning so much more to us as a nation in terms of our security and even the avoidance of future massive expansions than did all of our expenditures in Afghanistan from an overall US security uh, uh, perspective. Again, I apologize. We're talking about human beings and
Yes.
countries, and I apologize for that. But some of the conservative critique is literally focused, as you've been pointing out, Professor, on the dollar figures. For what the threat level that Russia poses now is as great as it's been, basically, right since Glasnost and Gorbachev
Hmm.
and
Yes.
this former USSR. For what we're spending there, that is an immense investment in our own security. This idea that the investment in Ukrainian defense is somehow not an investment in our own national defense, it still boggles my mind. I'll leave it to
Yes.
you for some closing thoughts, Professor.
No, I absolutely agree with that, and I share your concern that we haven't even talked about the human cost to Ukraine
Yes.
and the moral imperative to do the right thing, and of course, like those are really important, and I don't want to put that aside. But as you say, like from a strictly security perspective and an economics perspective, supporting Ukraine is definitely in our national interest, and it's relatively inexpensive way to counter this Russian threat.
My guest this half hour, we're going to have to leave it there, is Professor Yoshiko Herrera from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, a Russian expert in their political science department. Thank you so much, Professor. I'm Maggie Dawn. You're listening to the Civic Media Radio Network.